Today's shiur is Nedarim Daf Ayin Ches. Take note that today's shiur begins 3 lines from the bottom of Daf Ayin Zayin Omid Beis. Before we begin the shiur, we glance at the side at one of our features of the marked Gemaras, the HaRav Ozer, which we call the Nosei, the topic heading, where we've written Baal She'omar B'Loshen Chacham Mutar Lach. A husband, in attempting to annul his wife's vows, he uses the text of a sage, a Torah scholar, who is also empowered to annul vows, using the expression mutar lach. That's characteristic of the Torah sage in his annulment of vows. However, here we're talking about a husband that uses the Chocham's text, and vice versa. Chacham she'omar b'loshen Baal mufar lach. What is the result? Now the Gemara, 3 lines from the bottom. HaRav Yehonasan Chacham she'omar b'loshen Baal. A sage who is annulling a vow, but he uses the language of a husband. Ubal she'omar b'loshen Chacham. Or a husband that uses the language of a sage. The husband language is mufar lach. The sage version is mutar lach. So either way, Rabbi Yochanan says lo omar klum. It's ineffective. It's an ineffective annulment. Desanya. And this is based on the following Tanaic source. Zeh hadovar. This is a pasuk that's quoted in Bamidbar, Perek Lamed, pasuk Beis. When we get to the, you'll see on Daf Ayin Ches Amud Aleph at the top, we've added to the side of the Gemara the relevant psukim. In the meantime, the pasuk says in Bamidbar, which is the topic that deals with vows, and we learn from this term, Zeh hadovar hachacham matir v'ein Baal matir. A chacham is able to annul using the expression matir or hutar lach, which a Baal, a husband, is not allowed or not able to do. Shiachol, this word shiachol indicates I would have thought otherwise without the pasuk. What would I have thought? Uma chacham she'ein mefer matir, a sage who doesn't have the power of hafara, which we haven't given a source for that yet, but a sage does not have the power of hafara. Matir, Baal shemefer einodin shematir, a Baal which has the power of hafara, certainly he should be able to be matir. Talmud Lomar, we continue at the top of Ayin Ches Amud Aleph. Therefore, the Torah says Zeh hadovar. The pasuk, which is a pasuk indicating limitation, it's coming to exclude what I would have thought otherwise. Namely, I would have thought, through the logic we presented, that a Baal who can mefer certainly can be matir. So we learned from this, Zeh hadovar chacham matir v'ein Baal matir. Only a chacham is vested with that power of being matir, using that expression, and not a husband. Tanya idach. We have another source, and the source begins also with a quote from using this phrase Zeh hadovar, and we should draw your attention before we go through the entire source. 2 psukim are going to be referred to. One is the pasuk we already cited, that you can see on the side of our marked Gemaras in the upper corner of the page. We've added by Midbar Lamed Pasuk Beis, which deals with Nedarim. It says there, Vayedaber Moshe el Roshe Hamatos Livnei Yisrael Lemor Zeh Hadover Asher Tzivo Hashem. And Pasuk Gimel says, Ish ki yidor neder, etc. Lo yachel devaro. So you can see that in Pasuk Beis, Moshe Rabbeinu is addressing the Roshei Hamatos, the heads of the tribes, and he tells them, Zeh hadover, this is the matter that Hashem has commanded. And Pasuk Gimel shows that you're dealing with the topic of vows. There's another Pasuk in Vayikra, Perek Yudzayin Pasuk Beis, which deals with the topic of Shchutei Chutz. Shchutei chutz is a reference to the prohibition of sacrificing and offering sacrifices outside the Beis Hamikdash, or in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, outside of the Mishkan. So the pasuk says in Vayikra Perek Yud Zayin pasuk Beis, Daber el Aaron ve'el bonav. Do you notice that we're reading from the side of the Gemara where we've included the pot that we've written in the psukim? It says Daber el Aaron ve'el bonav ve'el kol bnei Yisrael v'yamartu aleim zeh hadavar asher tzivu Hashem leimor. Noticing again the expression zeh hadavar, and pasuk Gimel goes on to describe the topic ish mi beis Yisrael asher yishchat shor kesef o yeiz b'machne o asher yishchat michutz lemachane, which deals with the topic of shchutei chutz, slaughtering sacrifices outside the Beis Hamikdash. The psukim go on to say, pasuk Dalid, we've also included on the side, Vel Pesach al Moed lo hevio la'akriv korban Hashem lifnei Mishkan Hashem v'nichras ha'ishahu. The pasuk Dalid tells us that if one does not bring the sacrifice to the Beis Hamikdash, so he is guilty of kores, of the kores punishment. Now we turn to the source at the top of Ayin Ches Amud Aleph, the end of the line, first line, Tanya Idoch. And here we have another Tanaic source, Zeh Hadovar, Baal Mefer V'Ein Chacham Mefer. Similar to the previous source, here we have a limitation expression. And from this we learn that a husband has the power of hafara. A chacham is not meifir. And up till now we've been assuming that this has to do with the text or the expression that each one uses in annulling vows. So a husband uses the hafara expression, but not a chacham. Sheyachol. Without the pasuk, I would have thought, Uma Baal Shein Matir Meifir, a husband that doesn't have the power of being matir. He has the power of hafara. Chacham Shematir, a chacham who has the power of being matir, Eino Din Shemeifir, then all the more so, he should be able to be meifir. Talmud Lomar, Zeh Hadovar. Baal Meifir, V'Ein Chacham Meifir. So from here we see the teaching that we saw before in the name of Rabbi Yochanan at the bottom of Ayin Zayin Amud Beis, the point at which we began today's shiur, that each individual, the Chacham and the Baal, have their own unique expressions of vow annulment. There are other technical differences between Hafara and Hatara, but that is not something that we have to preoccupy ourselves with right now. The Tanaic source goes on to say, Nemar kan zeh hadovar, v'nemar lahalon zeh hadovar b'shchutei chutz. We already read the psukim, so you understand where this is coming from. We have in the topic of Hatoras Nedarim, zeh hadovar, b'midbar perek lamed pasuk beis, and in Vayikra Yud Zayin pasuk beis, which deals with shchutei chutz, the expression zeh hadovar. The diamond highlights the Gzeira Shava, and on the side of the under the Nosei Mivneh heading, Gzeira Shava Zeh Hadovar Bein Parshas Nedarim L'Parshas Shchutei Chutz. So what do we learn from this word comparison? We continue with the text. Ma b'shchutei chutz Aaron uvonov v'chol Yisrael. Just like in the case of shchutei chutz, they were spelled out. They were enumerated. Aaron and his children. His children is another two sons, Elazar and Isamar. And it also says in the pasuk, Kol Yisrael. So af parshas Nedarim, so too with regard to vows, understand Aaron uvonov v'chol Yisrael. Now this is very, very obscure. What in the world what's the significance of these names in these particular topics? The Gemara will deal with that later. What else? Uma kan, and what that which you find here by Nedarim, Roshei Hamatos, Af Lahalon Roshei Hamatos. So through the Gzeira Shava, we learn it's a two-directional Gzeira Shava. From Shchutei Chutz, we take the reference that you found in Vayikra to Aaron, Bonav Kol Yisrael, and you transfer that to Nedarim, and Rosh Hamatos, which you find by Nedarim and Bamidbar Lamed, you transfer that to Shchutei Chutz. As we go on in the Gemara, we will learn the explanation of this very obscure Tanaic source. So we have some highlight markings to enable you to see what is being focused on at each point. On the side of the Gemara, we have Roman numerals 1 and 2 that represent two gishot, two approaches to the matter at hand, which we'll see more clearly in the Gemara. The double underline highlights the expression, we'll say the reference to Roshei Hamatos, and the reference to Zeh Hadovar. Each one of them, the Roshei Hamatos, what is the point of having that Gzeira Shava to Nedarim from Shchutei Chutz? And likewise, the issue of Roshei Hamatos, what's the reason for that? So we have a question regarding the purpose of the Gzeira Shava. We have to deal with Aaron Ubanov, and we have to deal with Roshei Hamatos, namely the Gzeira Shava aspect. And we're also going to be focusing on the expression Zeh Hadovar that's written by Nedarim. What is it doing? What's its limitation? What's it for? And Zeh Hadovar that you have by Shchutei Chutz. What is its limitation? What is it excluding? We note on the side the house marking that we'll see, Hadgoshas Parshas Nedarim U'Shchutei Chutz. This highlights the respective topics that will be seen, topics that were cited. We also note on the side, Halachos Shenilmadu Migzeira Shavazu. Here we're informing you ahead of time what halachas are learned through the Gzeira Shava. Well, one halacha is lahachshir shloisha hedyotos lahataras nedarim. Through the Gzeira Shava of Aaron Uvonov, we know that three people were referred to in the pasuk, and they appeared in the case of Shchutei Chutz. And we, through the Gzeira Shava, we apply that to hataras nedarim. Namely, three are enough. 3 is the number, if you're using commoners, for the annulment of vows. The term Kol Yisrael in the pasuk by Shchutei Chutz, we also benefit from that, because that indicates that they don't have to be experts. Another halacha that's learned through the Gzeira Shava, if you recall, we learned from Nedarim to the topic of sacrifices. We learned a Gzeira Shava from Nedarim to sacrifices. What do we learn from that? What is revealed by that Gzeira Shava? So we will learn that Sheyesh She'ela B'Kochim. That means if one dedicates or one sanctifies something as a sacrifice, he can reverse his sanctification through she'ela, just like we've seen so many times in our recent shiurim, she'ela l'chacham, the approaching of a sage for the annulment of a vow. Likewise, a sanctification of an animal is a type of vow, and that sanctification also lends itself or is subject to annulment, if so desired. And we learn that from this Gzeira Shava, from the fact that the topic of Nedarim, which has annulment, is here to shed light on the topic of sacrifices, in order to tell me that by sacrifices also you have annulment, the idea of reversal of the sanctification that we just described. So now let's go through the Gemara very systematically, point by point. We continue now. But Parshas Nedarim Lemai Hilchasa. The last point of the Tanaic source was, I should say, that not the last point, but the second to last point, if you will. We said, just like by Shchutei Chutz, you have Aaron Uvanav V'chol Yisrael, so too by Nedarim, you have Aaron Uvanav V'chol Yisrael. So here the Gemara is asking, what's the value? What do we learn from that Gezerah Shava? So that's Beparshas Nedarim Lamai Hilchasa. Hilchasa, a reference to the oral tradition, to the Gezerah Shava word comparison method of exegesis. So what is the value in saying that by Parshas Nedarim we are also to understand Aaron Uvanav V'chol Yisrael? Omar Rav Acha Bar Yaakov lahachshir shloisha hedyotos. Just like by Parshas Shchutei Chutz, you see the reference to three individuals, Aaron and his two sons. So too by Nedarim, three commoners are capable, are licensed to absolve a vow. V'ha Roshei Hamatos Ksiv. The Gemara asks, how can you say Hedyotos when the pasuk in the context of the Nedarim itself says Roshei Matos, the heads of the tribes, which would imply experts. Omar Rav Chisda V'Tem Rav Yochanan B'Yochid Mumche. The concept of expertise is manifest when you're dealing with a single individual. If a single individual is going to be employed for the annulment of a vow, so he would have to be a mumche, an expert, as is alluded to or as is inferred by the term Roshei Hamatos, the heads of the tribes. They were scholars, they were experts. So just to review, the Gezerah Shava from Shchutei Chutz, Aaron Uvanav V'chol Yisrael, enables me to conclude that three commoners are able to annul a vow. If you want to focus on the Parsha of Nedarim itself, where it says Roshei Hamatos, that informs us that a single individual can rescind a vow, provided he is an expert. We continue. Roshei Hamatos b'Shchutei Chutz l'mai hilchasa. The reference to Roshei Hamatos, which is found by Nedarim, but through the Gezerah Shava, was transferred to Shchutei Chutz. For what purpose was that? What do we learn from that Gezerah Shava from Nedarim? Omar of Sheshes Lomar Sheyesh She'ela Behektish. It informs me that a vow, that something sanctified can be rescinded, can be reversed. The Gemara asks, L'Bei Shammai D'Omer Ein She'ela Behektish. Bei Shammai doesn't hold from this concept that hektish can be reversed. So Bei Shammai doesn't hold from that concept. Roshei Hamatos Diksiv b'Shchutei Chutz l'mai hilchasa. According to Bei Shammai, what's the purpose of transferring Nedarim information to Shchutei Chutz? The term Roshei Hamatos is a reference to something that's Nedarim related to Shchutei Chutz. What's the point if you Bei Shammai don't hold from the concept of she'ela behektish, the reversal of hektish, like the annulment of a vow? So then, what's the purpose of learning Shchutei Chutz or I should say, what's the purpose of learning from Nedarim to Shchutei Chutz? The Gemara answers very simply: Beis Shammai les lahu Gezerah Shava. They don't have as their Torah tradition, as their oral law tradition, this Gezerah Shava. And with that having been said, so Roshei Hamatos does not appear in the context of Shchutei Chutz. Namely, the idea or the concepts of Nedarim don't apply to Shchutei Chutz. The Gemara continues. Zeh hadavar beparshas Nedarim l'mai ksiv. Here we're focusing not on the oral tradition so much as what is the point of Zeh hadavar. Zeh hadavar is a limiting expression. What does it teach me when it comes to Nedarim? What's the limitation? Answer, loimar, it tells me, chocham matir ve'ein baal matir, baal mefer ve'ein chocham mefer. Now, the truth is that these last 2-3 lines is the whole reason this discussion has been cited. We continue. Zeh hadavar b'shchutei chutz l'mai ksiv. Again, the emphasis is on not the oral tradition, but rather the scriptural limitation. What does the Torah want to exclude when it says Zeh Hadavar, which is, we said, a limitation expression in the context of Shchutei Chutz? Answer, Lomar, the revelation is that Al Hashchita Chayav Ve'en Chayav Al Hamalika. The prohibition of sacrificing things outside the Beis HaMikdash will apply to the slaughtering of animals as opposed to birds. The slaughtering of animals that done outside of the Beis HaMikdash, slaughtering of sacrificial animals, would be the violation referred to in the pasuk. And what's excluded? Malika. Malika is the method in which bird sacrifices were killed. It's not through Shlita, which is severing the neck organs using a knife, but rather Malika, which is a different process of killing the bird. We don't have to get into details, but if one were to take a sacrificial bird and do Malika to it outside the Beis HaMikdash, he would not be guilty of this offense of Shchutei Chutz. The Gemara continues with a question posed to Beis Shammai. Now, we mentioned in passing that Beis Shammai does not have a Gezerah Shava. One of the, we'll say, benefits of the Gezerah Shava that we saw earlier was the limud from Shchutei Chutz to Nedarim of Aaron, Uvana, V'chol Yisrael, from which we learned the 3 hedyotos. Elo Beis Shammai, who doesn't hold from the Gezerah Shava, lahachshir gimel hedyotos min olam, where does he learn that 3 commoners are licensed to annul vows? The number was hinted to before by Aaron Uvanov, and Aaron Uvanov was written by Shchutei Chutz. We were able before Beis Shammai to use the Gezerah Shava to transfer that to Nedarim, but Beis Shammai doesn't have that mechanism. So what is the source of 3 hedyotas for Beis Shammai? Answer, and here we have a long answer, and we're going to. It takes a while to develop, but we'll see along the way where Beis Shammai is going to learn Gimel hedyotas for Hataras Nedarim. The Gemara answers, Nafka lahu midu Rav Asi bar Noson. He learns it from Rav Asi bar Noson's teaching. He will appear on the, we dashed, underlined his name on the first of the wide lines of the Gemara, so we'll get back to his name later. So we learned from Rav Asi, Dichtiv, the pasuk says, V'yadaber Moshes moyadei Hashem el bnei Yisrael, v'hotanya, and we have a brisa, Rabbi Yossi Haglili Omer, and here we're going to have something extremely obscure, but once again, we'll wait for the Gemara to elucidate. Rabbi Yossi Haglili Omer, Moyadei Nemru, Veloi Nemra, Shabbos Breishis Imohem. Shabbos Breishis is a reference to the weekly occurrence of Shabbos. It's called Shabbos Breishis, the Meforshim point out, because holidays, Mo'adim, are holidays. Holidays are also referred to by the term Shabbos. So in order to distinguish the weekly occurrence of Shabbos from holidays, the Torah refers to the weekly Shabbos as Shabbos Breishis. Shabbos which commemorates Breishis as the beginning of the Torah, Breishis Bar Elokinos Yisrael Haaretz, the creation. Every week we will say we recognize and we commemorate the fact that the Almighty is the creator of the world. Hence the term Shabbos Breishis. So the source is telling us something that I said is obscure. It says that the Torah speaks about the holidays, and it doesn't speak about Shabbos together with them. Ben Azai Omer, Moyadei Nemru, Velo Nemra, Velo Nemar Parshas Nedarim Imohem. Holidays are spoken about in the Torah, but vows are not spoken about about with the holidays. That's a literal translation of the source, and we're going to find this to be very perplexing. Rav Asi bar Nosan Kashile Hamas Nisa. Rav Asi bar Nosan had difficulty with this Tanaic source, and we'll show you later what the difficulty is. Also, Leonardo the Rav Sheshis Vlashke. Rav Asi visited Nahardo in trying to find Rav Sheshis and didn't find him there. Also, Basri Lemulza, he followed him to Mechuzah, and that's where he met up with Rav Sheshis. Omar Le, Rav Asi bar Nosan asks, Moya de Hashem Nemru v'lo Nemru Shabbos Bereishis Mohem. This is, of course, a quote from the source we just saw, which indicated that in the Torah it speaks about the holidays, and it doesn't speak about Shabbos together with them. But v'haksiv Shabbos Mohem. How can you say that it doesn't speak about Shabbos? When you open the Torah and you read the section in the Torah that deals with the holidays, it mentions Shabbos together with them. Rashi gives you the Pasuk background for these things. But we continue in the source. Vesu, another difficulty Rav Asi has. The point number 2 in the source. Moyadei Hashem nemru v'lo nemru parshas Nedarim moem. Misitra means next to it, by its side. Misitra ksiva means as follows. In the Torah, at the end of Parshas Pinchas, which is toward the end of the book of Bamidbar, at the end of Parshas Pinchas, there are many psukim dedicated to the holidays, and right after that, when you finish Pinchas, the next parsha you lead into is Parshas Matos. Parshas Matos is Bamidbar Lamed that we've been citing quite often, which deals with which deals with vows. So how can Ben Azai in this source say that the holidays are spoken about, but the issue of vows is not presented along with them? That's quite untrue. Parshas, right after the parsha of the holidays in Parshas Pinchas, the Torah goes right into the parsha of vows. Amalei hachi katoni. So Rav Sheshis tells him the source is to be understood thusly. We continue at the top of Amid Beis. Moyadei Hashem Srichin Kiddush Beisdin Shabbos Bereishis Ein Sricha Kiddush Beisdin. As far as point 1 is concerned, the holidays are distinguished from Shabbos insofar as the holidays require court sanctification. What we mean by that is, we'll use a very simple example. The holiday of Pesach comes out in the middle of Nisan. How do you know when the 15th of Nisan is to arrive? We'll say very simply, you count from the 1st of Nisan 2 weeks, and there you go. You're at 15th of Nisan. But how do you know when the beginning of Nisan takes place? So that's what we're telling you here. That's Kiddush Beisdin. Based on the testimony of witnesses concerning the sighting of the new lunar phase. Upon their witness testimony, Beisdin declares it to be a new month. So holidays are dependent on Kiddush Beisdin, but Shabbos Bereishis means the weekly appearance of Shabbos doesn't need any formal sanctification on the part of the court. Every week, when Shabbos comes, you observe Shabbos without any court sanctification. The Rosh explains on the very end of the narrow lines of the Rosh commentary. It says, Ein Sricha Kiddush Beisdin Shikachu Beisdin Yom Rishon. Beisdin doesn't have to sanctify Sunday as the beginning of the week in order for you to then count 7 days forward to get to Shabbos. Last Shabbos Yom Shvi. Uksiv Moyadei Hashem Yisera Limute Shabbos Mikiddush Beisdin. The Torah has an extra expression, and that's what we've been alluding to all the time when we say Moadei Hashem is an extra expression that differentiates between the holidays that do require Kiddush Beisdin and the appearance of Moadei Hashem, extra time in the Torah, says only Moadei Hashem requires Kiddush Beis Din, and not Shabbos Breishis, not the weekly Shabbos. The second point, we continue in the Gemara. Moadei Hashem tzrichin mumche, v'ein parshis nedarim tzrichin mumche. Afilu Beis Din hedyotos. Notice we've underlined this because this is the reason we brought this whole long answer in. Don't forget, we asked, according to Beis Shammai, how does he know that 3 hedyotos are acceptable? So the answer to that is from the fact that the expression Moadei Hashem, which is we'll say an exclusionary point, as we already explained, that only Moadei Hashem, they require Beis Din, which represents experts, but not Parshas Nedarim. Parshas Nedarim means the annulment of vows does not require experts. What is sufficient? Have 3 commoners is sufficient. That's Beis Din hedyotos. The Gemara asks, well, the same question as we asked before we got to Beis Shammai. The same question is asked on Beis Shammai. But in Parshas Nedarim, when you're doing with vows, in Bamidbar Perek Lamed, it says Roshei Hamatos, the heads of the tribes, and they were experts. Rav Chisda v'tei Rav Yochanan, some versions have Rav Yochanan answering b'yochid mumche. The concept of having expertise by vow annulment, that's true if you're using a singular individual for the annulment. A chocham, you need to have an expert. But if you're going to use 3 people, they don't have to be experts. 3 commoners are sufficient. As you can see, we have a slash mark indicating that which follows is a new trend of thought. We also have a rare marking, the firebox marking, which highlights either a name or a sheet, in this case, a name that his halacha is going to preoccupy the Gemara for quite a long time. Before we get into the text, we glance at the side. We have a topic heading, Hashoiseit almanas lemekat. A husband hears his wife's vow, remains silent, with the intention not of substantiating her vow, but rather the mekat. Mekat literally means to infuriate, but it means he wants her to feel the pain of her vow before he, let's say, expresses his objection to the vow. He wants her to feel the pain of the vow. So it's silence, but it's not a silence of approval. Quite the contrary. According to Rabbi Chanina, the husband can be mefer even 10 days later. The idea that we've seen often in this parak, that based on the Torah, that a husband has only till the end of the day to annul vows, that is true if he hears the vow and remains silent, and his silence is not one of objection. So then Rabbi Chanina will tell you, if he's being silent and he's not saying anything, well, by sundown he can't now annul it. Everything we've said in the last couple of minutes is within the opinion of Rabbi Chanina. The Gemara is going to challenge Rabbi Chanina, and by the end of this sugya you're going to see that his halacha is not accepted. And you'll notice triangles that appear, and they are explained under the Mivneh heading. You see, we've written on the side, Kushos al Rabbi Chanina. These are challenges, and if you do what we often recommend doing, the bird's eye view of the sugya, you'll notice there are 5 challenges till the end of the perek, to the lower part of Ayin Tes Amud Aleph. Now the Gemara. Omer Rabbi Chanina, Hashoisek amanas lemekat. A husband who remains silent, not in order to be mekayim, to substantiate her vow, but he does so in order to chastise her, so that she shouldn't be a regular in vowing. Let her feel the pain of her vow beforehand. So a husband who remains silent in order lemekat, then Mefer Afilu Mikan V'ad Asar Yomim, he can annul the vow even 10 days later. Mosiv Rava. Rava raises a challenge from the following source. Again, these are topics that we've seen in the past. When was it said that with the death of the husband, an orus, you have an orus is a husband at the first stage of marriage who is able to annul his wife's vows in conjunction or in partnership with her father. So amongst the rules, we learned that if the husband dies, so his powers of annulment are transferred to her father. That's nisroitna rishus lav. When do we say that? Bisman shelo shoma habal. That's when the husband didn't hear the vow. O sheshama v'shasak, he heard the vow and remained silent. O sheshama v'hofer umeis bo bayom, or he heard the vow, he annulled, and he died that very day. So in any one of those cases, then the whatever powers of annulment that the husband had are transferred to the father of the girl. Avol shama v'kiyim. However, if the husband heard and he substantiated the wife's vow, o sheshama v'shasak umeis biyoyim shel achrav, or he heard it, remained silent, and then died the next day, ein yochel ofer, the vow cannot be annulled. The father can't annul the vow. Once a husband substantiates the wife's vow, so the father, though they work in partnership, the father can no longer annul it. Now the last point, well, you can see we've dashed underlined key words which describe the husband having heard it and remained silent. That's the key word is v'shasak, he remained silent, and died the next day. My lav, the Gemara goes on. B'shosek amanas meikad. It says, the source says, husband heard it and remained silent. Doesn't qualify the silence. It means even a silence of wrath, of opposition, if you will, it doesn't make a difference. He cannot mefer the next day. No, that's not the correct understanding. Rather, b'shoisek amanas l'kayim. The source described a husband who remained silent out of approval. He was quiet, he was happy, he was in approval of his wife's vow. Well, if that's how you're going to explain the word v'shasak, then hainu oy shama v'kiyim. But the very same source said shama v'kiyim. Why the redundancy? So you can't tell me that shosek means it was a silence with the intention of substantiation. The Gemara answers, you're right on that point. Elo b'shoisek stam. He remained silent without any specific decision in mind. So that situation is such that if he remains silent out of indifference, by the next day he can't be mefer anymore. However, silence with the intention of lameikat, to infuriate, that is different. He is able to be mefer even 10 days later, as Rabbi Chanina said. Okay, so triangle 1, Rava's attempted question on him was ultimately rebuffed, was ultimately answered. Mosif Rav Chisda. Well, Rav Chisda, number 2. He raises an objection to Rabbi Chanina's teaching from the following source. Chomer b'hakem mi'b'hafer u'b'hafer mi'b'hakem. There are stringencies and uniquenesses that apply to hakoma, substantiation of vows, that you don't find by annulment. And likewise, uniqueness and stringency that you find by hafara, that you don't find by hakoma, by substantiation. And we now go over these points. Chomer b'hakem, the stringency that you find by substantiation of vows. We continue at the top of Ayin Tes Amud Aleph. Shehashtika mekayemes ve'in shtika mevateles. Silence is capable of establishing the vow. Silence on the part of the husband is capable of establishing the wife's vow. In other words, a woman who had vowed and the husband remains silent, through that the vow is established. However, silence cannot result in the vow being undone, being annulled. Kiyem belibo, kiyem. Hafer belibo, eno mufer. If a husband substantiates the wife's vow in his heart, that is effective. Annulment in his heart, that's not effective. Kiyem ein yochel lahafer. Hafer ein yochel l'kayem. Once there is a formal substantiation, it cannot be annulled. And if it's annulled, it can't be substantiated. There are a number of details in this source, but we want to focus on just one point. Kotoni, it said in this source, shashtika mekayemes. Silence substantiates vows, and that would imply it can no longer be undone, it can no longer be annulled. My love, b'shosek amanas l'mekat. This source was unqualified, just said silence, all silence, even silence to infuriate. Nevertheless, he loses his chance of being mefer. That's mekayemes. It substantiates. So silence amanas l'mekat substantiates vows. That is contrary to Rabbi Chanina. No, there's more answers. That's not the right understanding. The shtika mekayemes referred to in this source is b'shoisek amanas l'kayem. It's a silence with the intention of substantiating. The Gemara asks, well, then we have a problem of redundancy again. Kiyem belibo kiyem. It says if he substantiates her vow in his heart, it's substantiated. It becomes a solidified vow. So how can you say that shtika is shtika of approval? So my answer is you're right. Ella b'shoisek stam. He's silent with indifference. But if he were silent almanas l'mekat, he would still, yes, be able to annul the vow, as Rabbi Chanina taught. You can see we have a bracketed section, and the note that we have on the side, if you skip the brackets momentarily, you'll see the continued series of questions raised against Rabbi Chanina. So within the brackets, though, the Gemara deals with a detail that we alluded to before, we mentioned before in the source. So that having been said, let's read through the bracketed section. We demonstrated the severity, the strength that you find by hakoma that you don't find by hafara, namely silence. We said is substantiates, but silence cannot annul. So there's a strength of silence is manifest in the case of substantiation, not in annulment. Now, the same source said that there was a chumrah by hafara over hakoma. So, behafer bi behakim in Olam. Where do you see a stringency by hafara that you don't find by hakoma? Amar Rav Yochanan nisholin ala hakem ve'ein nisholin ala hafer. If a husband substantiates his wife's vow, it can be reversed through approaching a chacham and being shoyal on the hakoma. Shoyal means the seeking of annulment of his hakoma. However, when a husband annuls the wife's vow, that annulment is not reversed, cannot be reversed. Mosiv Rav Kahana. We're going to present a Tanaic source, and let's note ahead of time an interesting phenomenon in this Gemara. After the Tanaic source, you can see we've highlighted using a crown shape the term tiyufta. Tiyufta means a rejection. On the side, under the Mivneh heading, you can see we've noted this crown shape, and we've written Havlotas Tiyufta. We've highlighted Tiyufta He'ora. I want to point something out. That Kushios 3 through 5, the questions, the objections that are numbered 3, 4, and 5, Nisharos Ketiyufta l'Rebbe, they remain as challenges, as refutations to Rabbi Hanina. So even though in attempts number 1 and 2 to ask on him, he was able to rebuff the attack, not so when it comes to 3, 4, and 5. The Gemara, Mosiv Rav Kahana, V'im hacharesh yacharish lo isha v'chulei. The pasuk appears in the context of a husband who hears his wife's vow and remains silent. B'shoisek almanas lemekat hakosav medaber. This is describing a husband who remains silent in order to infuriate the wife. And it says in this pasuk, it says v'hekim es kol nedareh, that her vows through his silence, her vows are substantiated. You're saying that this expression is a reference to silence for mekat purposes. Who says? Maybe it's silence with substantiation intention. Well, that's not so. Kishu Omer ki echrish lo, a citation of another pasuk, ki echrish lo. That pasuk deals with silence with substantiation intention. So what am I going to do with these? The reference here to silence. Silence with the intent of infuriating her is what the pasuk is talking about, and even then her vow is substantiated through his silence. Tifta, well, that would be then a refutation of Rabbi Hanina. Rabbi Hanina said that shoisik al manas mekat is not a substantiation of the vow. If it were, how could he say that 10 days later he could annul it? Once a vow is substantial, it can't be annulled through a husband. The Gemara asks, "V'loikim ha b'shoisek almanas l'kayim ha b'shoisek stam." Why don't we rebuff this question the way we've done so in approaches 1 and 2 before, by saying the double reference to silence can be accounted for a silence of substantiation intention and a silence of indifference. But almanas l'mekat, he could still yes annul it. In other words, that does not constitute a hakoma. Why didn't we say this in rebuffing the question? The Gemara answers kroi yeseri ksivi, and we look in the Ran toward the end of the narrow line, third to last narrow line. Ran says kroi yeseri ksivi tlosa kroi ksivi. There are 3 references. Hachresh yachrish trei ki hechrish lo ha tlosa. 3 references to silence. How do you account for all the different kinds of silence? The only way to do so is to include silence even lamekat, even with that intention, and still the Torah says the vow of the wife is substantiated. He didn't annul it. Mosiv Rav. We continue in the Gemara with the 4th question. The student of Talmud probably is asking himself, once you've refuted a particular opinion, why do you have to continue with more refutations? So the Ran is sensitive to this question. And you see the Ran on the first wide line. He says on the third, he says, Afagav the itoisiv chada zimna, even though Rabbi Hanina was already rejected once, we ask more questions on him. The practical, outcome of the additional refutations is the mashchina piruka ba'hidiliel akatihav yahach tivte. Even if you find a response, a defense for the earlier question, we will still be left with these rejections. So let's continue. Mosiv Rava Nodra im chashecha meifilo ad shelo chashecha. A woman who vowed before nightfall, the husband can annul it, provided he does so before nightfall. Shimlo hofer v'choshcha einu yochel hofer. If he doesn't annul the vow and nightfall sets in, he can no longer annul. The Gemara asks, why do you say that if he doesn't annul? If he doesn't annul, so obviously he's silent. Why do we say that if we accept Rabbi Chanina as true, why does this source say that if he doesn't annul before sundown, he can no longer annul? Why not simply view him as someone who was silent, who didn't annul, because of displeasure, because he wanted to infuriate her? But yet that's not an option. The source says if he doesn't formally annul before sundown, that's it. Indicating that even if he is silent out of lemeikat reasons to infuriate her, that doesn't help. And he loses his ability to be mefer. Tufta, that's a refutation of Rabbi Chanina. Mosiv Ravashi. Ravashi cites the following source. Yodea ani sheyesh nedarim aval eini yodea sheyesh mefirin. A man says, I know that there's a concept of vows, but I don't know that there's a concept of a husband being able to annul the vow. Yofer. If that took place, and we tell him, you could be mefer, so he is able, he's allowed to be mefer. Yodea ani sheyesh mefirin aval eini yodea shezeh neder. If a man says, I know that there's a concept of vows being annulled by husbands, I just didn't realize that this, whatever she said, constitutes a vow. As Rashi says, I didn't realize that this is a neder of significance that needs to be annulled. If that's what a person says, Rabbi Meir lo yofer, Meir says, you lost your chance to be mefer. For the Chachamim say he's allowed to be mefer. But focusing on Rabbi Meir, now notice we underline the expression lo yofer. If Rabbi Chanina is correct, why not view this guy who obviously, he wasn't mefer, but leve kishoisik almanas lemeikat. Why don't we view him as someone who remained silent for lemeikat purposes? This guy is not interested. He's not interested in the vow. He just didn't realize that it has sufficient significance to warrant annulment. He's not happy with the vow. He just didn't bother annulling it. So if Rabbi Chanina is correct, why would Rabbi Meir say lo yofer? We could look together at the Ran, 4 lines from the end of the Ran commentary in this parak. He says, V'im isa, the shoysek amanasameka mefer. If that were so, like Rabbi Chanina says, that silence with the meikat intention is still subject to annulment, Amayomer Amir lo yofer. Why does Rabbi say he can't annul? Ihu lo shasak elo mishum t'shelo yodeh sheyochol lahofer. His silence here wasn't because he liked the vow. He just didn't realize that he's able to annul it. The Ran points out the ad kan lo pligi rabbonon aled Rabbi Meir lemishum desvir lehu de lo havia shmiya. Up till this point, the rabbonon disagree with Rabbi Meir on a technical point that a fellow like this who says, I know that there's mefirin, I didn't realize that this needs hafara, is not considered having heard the vow. But if you have a situation that is definitely considered shmiya, definitely considered having heard the vow, which is a prerequisite, of course, for the husband to be mefer, so modu le de lo yofer, the Rabbanan would have agreed with Rabbi Meir that you can no longer be mefer. Elavadai mashma t'shoisek amnas l'meikat lo motzi mefer. So therefore, we would conclude, according to all opinions, that a person who remains silent, even though his intention was to infuriate her, he still cannot be mefer. Hilkoch naktina. Therefore, we hold the shoisek amanas l'meikat kistam. One who's silent with meikat intention is like the person who remains silent out of indifference. V'lo motzi mefer elo b'yom shmiya bovad. He cannot be mefer unless it's within the same day that he heard it. V'shoisek almanas l'kayim la'alter. Shuv Eino Yochel Lahafer Afilu Bo Bayom. One who is silent with the intention of substantiating the vow, then it's substantiated immediately, and he cannot be mefer even within the same day. So what the Ran lays out for us are all three categories of shtika: shtika manas l'mekat, shtika manas l'kayim, and in the middle the shtika of stam, of indifference. So we go back to the Gemara text, and as we saw, Rabbi Meir said, a man who says, I know there's such a thing as hafara, I just didn't realize that this needed hafara. Rabbi Meir says he can't be mefer anymore, and we asked if Rabbi Chanina is correct, so why can't we just view him as shoisek amanas l'mekat? And you see that we don't. We said, lo yafer, tiyufta. This is a refutation of Rabbi Chanina, who said he could still be mefer. That we've concluded the 10th parak of Nedarim. With that, we conclude our shiur for today.